The descent thrusters screamed against the thick, ionized air of Xylos. Inside the cockpit, the navigation console flickered, struggling to compensate for the erratic gravitational pulls of the planet. Elias gripped the flight stick, his knuckles white, as the ship shuddered through a layer of dense violet-tinted clouds. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical groan, but the left strut failed to lock. Elias slammed his fist against the override switch, forcing the hydraulic piston to engage just as the ship plummeted toward the surface. The hull scraped against the jagged terrain, sending a shower of sparks into the dark. The ship lurched, tilted violently to the right, and then slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring thud. Dust, fine and violet, billowed up to coat the viewport, obscuring the horizon. The engine whine died away, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of cooling metal. Silence reclaimed the space, heavy and absolute. Elias waited for the internal pressure to equalize. The hiss of the airlock was the only sound in the pressurized cabin. He pressed the release, but the ramp stopped halfway, caught on a jagged piece of twisted alloy embedded in the ground. He stepped forward, braced his shoulder against the metal, and shoved. The ramp groaned, shuddered, and finally slammed down into the violet dust with a heavy, metallic clang. He stepped out. The air here was thin, biting, and smelled of oxidized iron. His boots crunched against a thick layer of metallic debris, shattered spires, broken circuitry, and pulverized stone that crunched like glass. He stood still, listening. The silence was absolute, pressing against his ears with a physical weight. He checked his surroundings, his eyes scanning the jagged silhouettes, but found only the stillness of a place long dead. Above the horizon, the sky began to bruise. A single flash of green light tore through the clouds, jagged and sharp, illuminating the jagged debris field in a sickly, neon glow. Elias watched as the lightning pulsed, not randomly, but in a steady, rhythmic cadence. With every flash, a low-frequency hum rippled outward, vibrating through the soles of his boots and up into his marrow. The ground beneath him seemed to breathe, a subtle tremor that rattled the loose metal scraps scattered across the plaza. He reached out to steady himself against a rusted bulkhead, but the metal was singing with the same frequency, humming against his palms. The sky churned faster now, the green arcs of energy thickening, weaving into a web of light that hung heavy over the city. The air grew dense, charged with static, that made the fine violet dust dance in erratic, swirling patterns around his feet. He took a step, but the vibration caught him off balance, forcing him to widen his stance to remain upright. The hum deepened, shifting from a background drone to a physical pressure that pushed against his chest, rhythmic and unrelenting. Elias pushed forward, leaving the relative safety of his ship behind. He climbed a mound of compacted, rusted alloy to gain a clear line of sight. The view that met him was absolute in its desolation. Oros did not look like a city. It looked like a vast, petrified forest of obsidian. Towers rose in jagged, irregular clusters, their surfaces slick and light-absorbing, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. Many of the spires had snapped under their own weight, leaning at precarious angles like broken teeth in a rotting jaw. He walked through the main thoroughfare, where the buildings crowded in, their walls covered in deep, vertical gouges that looked like claw marks from a titan. There was no glass in the windows, only hollow, dark voids that seemed to watch his progress. The silence returned, heavier than before. He felt small, an intruder in a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. Every structure was a monument to a forgotten collapse. The dread was not in the storm above, but in the stillness of the stone around him, a cold, unyielding weight that promised nothing but finality. Elias halted in the center of the plaza, the silence pressing against his ears. He reached into his belt and pulled out the motion tracker. The screen was dark for a heartbeat, then sputtered to life with a harsh blue flicker. He tapped the side of the casing, his thumb sliding over the cold, ridged surface. The display stabilized, showing a grid of the surrounding ruins. He held his breath, watching the scan sweep across the perimeter. A faint, jagged line pulsed as the sensor hit a collapsed hangar to his left. Then, the screen stuttered. A single red dot blinked into existence. It moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, darting behind the twisted metal of the hangar walls. Elias squinted, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the sensitivity dial. The dot vanished, then reappeared 3 meters closer, shifting its position with impossible speed. His pulse quickened. The tracker emitted a low, rhythmic chirp. He rotated the device, trying to lock onto the signal, but the dot danced across the screen, erratic and unpredictable. It was moving toward him. He looked up from the glowing display, scanning the shadows of the hangar. The graveyard was no longer empty. Something was pacing the ruins. Elias lowered the tracker, his hand moving instinctively to the holster at his side. He gripped the handle of his pulse rifle, feeling the sharp, biting cold of the steel against his palm. He pulled the weapon free, with a sharp metallic rasp that seemed to echo too loudly in the stagnant air. He checked the power cell, his fingers finding the release catch and sliding it home with a solid, satisfying click. The weight of the rifle was substantial, a grounding force in the shifting shadows of the ruins. He adjusted his grip, his knuckles whitening. He flicked the safety toggle, the mechanism sliding into place with a crisp, mechanical snap. The weapon hummed, a low-frequency vibration. He brought the rifle to his shoulder, resting his cheek against the cold casing. The sight picture was clear, the reticle glowing. The erratic red dot on his tracker was still moving, but now he was no longer a target. He was a threat. Elias stepped over a rusted bulkhead, his boots striking the slick pavement with a sharp, resonant clack. He moved into the main plaza, the space opening up like a vast, jagged wound in the planet's surface. All around him, the city rose in silence. Obsidian towers stretched toward the churning green sky, their frames stripped of everything but the core structural beams. They looked like giant, skeletal fingers clawing at the atmosphere. He took another step, and the sound bounced back at him, amplified by the hollow shells of the buildings. The echo traveled up the spires and returned, distorted and layered, making it impossible to tell if he was truly alone. He paused, his gaze tracing the lines of the twisted alloy. Every surface was pitted and scarred by centuries of exposure to the storm. He walked toward the center of the plaza, his movements deliberate. The ground beneath him vibrated, a low-frequency hum that seemed to originate from deep within the city foundations. He looked up, and the spires seemed to lean inward. He kept his rifle raised, scanning the gaps between the towers, but the architecture offered no shelter, only a labyrinth of sight lines that left him completely exposed. Elias stood motionless in the center of the plaza, the silence pressing against his ears. He turned his head slowly, scanning the row of obsidian towers for any sign of movement. Without warning, the air was ripped apart by a screech of grinding metal. It erupted from a ventilation shaft embedded in the base of a nearby spire, a sound like tectonic plates sliding against one another. The vibration traveled through the pavement, rattling the soles of his boots and sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. He pivoted instantly, bringing his rifle to bear on the vent. The metal casing of the shaft was twisted outward, jagged edges vibrating as the sound died away into a series of sharp, metallic pops. He held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger, listening for the echo to fade. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with the anticipation of what had caused such a violent release. He took a half step back, his eyes locked on the dark aperture of the vent. The silence did not last. From the darkness beyond the ventilation shaft, a new sound emerged, rhythmic and heavy. It was a dull thud, the sound of something massive striking the pavement with every movement. Elias shifted his weight, his boots barely grazing the grit of the plaza floor. The thudding grew louder, punctuated by the harsh grating noise. It was a slow, deliberate cadence that suggested immense weight. He squinted into the gloom, trying to isolate the source. The sound echoed off the hollow towers, creating a disorienting effect that made the creature seem to be everywhere at once. The dragging sound intensified, a wet, scraping friction that set his teeth on edge. It was moving closer, tracing a path through the debris. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle, his knuckles white. The rhythmic thudding became a steady, ominous pulse. He realized then that the creature was not merely wandering, it was patrolling, its heavy gait leaving deep gouges in the metallic dust. The dragging sound grew into a roar of friction against the ground. Elias realized he was standing in the open, a target in the center of the plaza. He scanned the immediate area and spotted a cluster of rusted, rectangular crates stacked against a collapsed hangar wall. He moved, his boots silent on the dust, but a loose piece of scrap metal skittered under his heel. The noise was sharp, a sudden intrusion. He didn't look back. He lunged for the crates, sliding behind the stack just as the rhythmic thudding stopped. He pressed his back against the cold, pitted surface of the metal containers. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm. He forced himself to inhale in slow, measured increments, his chest rising and falling in shallow, controlled bursts. He squeezed his eyes shut, listening to the silence that had returned to the plaza. It was no longer empty. It was expectant. He gripped his rifle, the cold steel biting into his palm, and waited. He did not move. He did not blink. He simply existed in the narrow space. Elias remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the gap between the rusted crates. The silence of the plaza was absolute. Static air prickled, then a hangar shift. Darkness stretched, a palpable entity from the abyss. The shadow moved with a terrifying liquid grace, sliding across the uneven ground as if the terrain were frictionless. It did not walk. It flowed, its edges blurred and jagged, constantly shifting in size and shape. Elias watched, his grip tightening on his rifle until his fingers ached. The shadow glided toward the center of the plaza, bypassing the debris and the scattered scrap metal with an eerie, predatory focus. It moved with a fluid, undulating motion that defied the rigid geometry of the city. Every time the green lightning pulsed overhead, the shadow seemed to ripple. It reached the center of the plaza and slowed, its dark mass coalescing into a singular, dense silhouette. It stood there, a void, waiting. The creature stood at the heart of the plaza, a silent void amidst the ruins. It did not possess a face, yet its intent was unmistakable. Slowly, the top of its mass began to shift, the jagged edges curling inward until a distinct, narrow protrusion formed. It tilted its head at a sharp, unnatural angle, the motion jerky and mechanical. The creature began to sniff the air, a series of rhythmic, wet inhalations that cut through the low-frequency hum of the planet. It was searching. The air around it seemed to ripple as it sampled the atmosphere, testing for the scent of life. It turned its head toward the north, then the south, its movements precise and calculated. Every inhalation drew the stagnant air of the city deep into its form. It paused, the head remaining locked in a fixed position for several seconds, as if processing a faint chemical trail. Then, it pivoted. The creature began to glide forward again, its path no longer aimless. It was tracking. Elias held his breath, as the creature drifted closer to the crates. Elias needed to know what he was dealing with. The creature was 10 feet away, its form a shifting mass of dark, oily smoke that seemed to absorb the dim light of the storm. He kept his pulse rifle braced against his shoulder with his left hand, while his right hand slowly reached toward his utility belt. His fingers brushed the cold, textured surface of the motion scanner. He pulled it free, the device heavy and solid in his palm. His thumb hovered over the activation button, his movements deliberate and slow, to avoid any sound. He was sweating, the moisture making his skin slick and treacherous. He pressed the button, but his thumb slid off the plastic casing. His hand jerked, striking the edge of a jagged piece of rusted alloy resting on the crate. The metal shifted. It tumbled off the pile, hitting the pavement with a sharp, metallic clang that rang out like a bell in the dead, suffocating silence of the plaza. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scanner clattered to the ground, its screen flickering with a frantic red light. The echo of the metal hitting the ground died away, leaving a silence more heavy than before. The creature stopped. It did not merely pause. It locked into place, its shifting form instantly turning rigid. The fluid, undulating motion that had defined its approach vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute stillness. Elias watched from behind the crates, his muscles coiled and ready to spring. He did not move a single finger. The creature tilted its head, the motion slow and deliberate, as if it were listening to the fading vibrations of the impact. Then, it turned. The entire mass of the entity rotated with a mechanical precision, its focus snapping directly toward the pile of crates. There was no hesitation. Elias felt the weight of that gaze, even though the creature lacked eyes. It was a cold, piercing recognition that cut through the darkness. The creature leaned forward, its jagged edges sharpening, and began to glide toward the crates with a new, terrifying speed. The creature did not charge. It flowed. Its jagged, obsidian-like edges began to melt, the solid mass turning into a dark, viscous liquid that rippled with every movement. It poured over the uneven ground, ignoring the debris, its form stretching and contracting like smoke caught in a gale. Elias gripped his pulse rifle, his knuckles white against the cold metal. He watched the entity reshape itself, its silhouette elongating until it resembled a blade of living shadow. The creature reached the center of the plaza and stopped, its head snapping toward the crates with a sound like dry parchment tearing. It was testing the air, its surface shimmering with a faint, oily iridescence. Elias shifted his weight, his boots pressing into the violet dust, and the creature reacted instantly. It reared back, its form hardening. The entity lunged, its shadow engulfing the crates, and for a heartbeat, the hunter and the prey were locked in a singular, lethal focus. Elias did not wait for the strike. He shoved the crates aside with his shoulder and bolted into the open. His boots skidded on the slick, violet-dusted pavement, his feet searching for purchase on the uneven metallic surface. He felt his balance waver, his center of gravity shifting wildly as he fought to stay upright. Behind him, the sound of the creature's movement was a rhythmic, wet thudding. He pushed his legs harder, his lungs burning with the intake of thin metallic air. The plaza stretched out before him, a vast expanse of debris. He ignored the pulse rifle in his grip, focusing entirely on the jagged spire rising ahead like a crooked finger against the storm. His boots hit a patch of loose alloy, sending sparks flying as he scrambled to regain his footing. He didn't look back. He could feel the temperature dropping, a cold draft trailing the entity as it pursued him across the plaza. He reached the edge of the plaza, his muscles screaming, and threw himself toward the narrow entrance, desperate to put solid walls between himself and the shadow. Elias launched his body into the air, his fingers outstretched toward the dark threshold of the spire. He was mid-stride, feet inches off the ground, when the air behind him ionized. A searing beam of concentrated light roared past his ear, the heat so intense it singed the air into a sharp, metallic tang. He didn't land so much as he collided with the corridor wall, his shoulder slamming into the obsidian surface with a sickening thud. The beam struck the exterior masonry a fraction of a second later, turning the stone into molten slag. The force of the impact sent a shock wave through the corridor, vibrating the floor plates and rattling Elias's teeth. He scrambled deeper into the dark, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pressed his back against the cold, jagged interior wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Outside, the beam flickered and died, leaving behind the smell of ozone and burnt rock. He gripped his rifle, knuckles white, and listened. The silence of the corridor was absolute, save for the rhythmic, heavy thud of the creature pacing just outside the entrance. He was inside, but the predator was still there. Elias turned away from the entrance and faced the spiral staircase. It was a rusted, skeletal structure that wound upward into the gloom of the spire. He grabbed the railing, but the metal was brittle, flaking away under his grip like dry ash. He took the first step, and the entire flight groaned, a long metallic shriek that echoed through the hollow building. He moved quickly, his boots clanging against the perforated steps. Halfway up, a tread snapped beneath his weight, sending a shower of debris cascading into the dark void below. He lurched forward, arms flailing, and caught the edge of the next landing. He hung there for a heartbeat, his muscles burning, listening to the sound of the metal swaying in the wind. The structure was failing. Every movement he made sent vibrations through the frame, causing the entire staircase to shudder and tilt. He pulled himself up, his breath ragged. He focused on the rhythm of his own heartbeat and the persistent, rhythmic clicking that had begun to rise from the floor below. Elias stumbled onto the final landing, his boots sliding on the slick, dust-covered floor. Before him stood a console, its surface pitted with age but still humming with a faint, rhythmic pulse of blue light. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his pack, his fingers brushing against the cold, jagged edge of the data spike. The building groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated through the soles of his feet. The floor tilted sharply to the left, and he slammed into the console to keep from falling. He braced his shoulder against the frame, his weight pinning him to the terminal as he fumbled for the access port. The metal casing was frozen shut, sealed by layers of oxidation. He drove the tip of the spike into the seam, his muscles straining and twisted with everything he had. The metal shrieked, then gave way with a sharp metallic snap. He jammed the spike deep into the port. The terminal flickered, the blue light turning a blinding, frantic white. Lines of alien script began to scroll across the surface. The scrolling script slowed, then snapped into a crystalline grid. Elias squinted as the display expanded, projecting a three-dimensional wireframe of the entire city. His heart hammered against his ribs. The map was not static. It pulsed with thousands of tiny, crimson heat signatures, all clustered in the subterranean levels directly beneath his feet. They were not dead. They were dormant. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not landed in a graveyard. He had stepped into a nursery. The terminal screen flickered, highlighting a sequence of commands that were currently executing. A progress bar raced toward completion, labeled in a jagged, alien syntax. The city was initiating a wake-up cycle. Every heat signature on the map began to shift, moving in unison toward the surface access points. The floor beneath him gave a sharp, violent lurch, nearly snapping the data spike from the port. He grabbed the console with his free hand, his knuckles white. The silence of the city was gone, replaced by a low, guttural vibration that started deep in the bedrock and climbed through the walls. He was the catalyst. He had triggered the hive, and now the entire city was waking up to hunt him. The floor tilted 45 degrees, sending Elias sliding across the slick metallic deck. He clawed at the wall, his fingers scraping against jagged alloy, but the momentum was too great. He slammed into the far bulkhead, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Above him, the ceiling groaned, a sound of tortured metal screaming under impossible pressure. The entire building was shifting, tearing itself away from the bedrock. As the planet itself began to heave, dust and debris rained down from the rafters, choking the air. Elias pushed himself up, but the floor bucked again, a violent tectonic jolt that threw him back down. Outside, the low-frequency hum escalated into a deafening roar that rattled his teeth. The walls began to buckle inward, the structural supports snapping like dry twigs. He scrambled toward the center of the room, trying to find a stable anchor, but the floor was a moving sea of shifting plates. The building was a falling stone. Elias hauled himself toward the shattered window, his boots slipping on the buckled floor. He braced his shoulder against the frame, gasping for air as the building finally groaned to a halt. Outside, the storm had reached its peak. A jagged bolt of green lightning tore across the sky, bathing the entire city in a sickly, radioactive glow. The illumination lasted only a second, but it was enough. The streets below were no longer empty. Thousands of dark, elongated silhouettes were rising from the pavement, pouring out of the ventilation shafts and cracked foundations like ink spilling into water. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace, their limbs twitching in the strobe-like rhythm of the storm. The plaza, once a silent graveyard, was now a churning sea of motion. Elias watched, paralyzed, as the silhouettes turned their heads toward his position. The dormant city had become a living trap, and every shadow in the plaza was now locked onto the building where he stood. Elias stared at the terminal. The scrolling alien script didn't just show a map. It showed a sequence of activation codes linked to his own ship's landing signature. He had not just arrived. He had initiated the wake-up. The realization hit harder than the seismic tremors. He jammed his hand into the port to rip the data spike free, but the terminal hissed, locking the device in place with a magnetic seal. He didn't have time to fight the machine. He snatched his rifle from the floor, checked the power cell, and turned toward the stairwell. The building was already vibrating with the impact of hundreds of bodies colliding with the exterior walls. He sprinted, his boots hammering against the metal grating of the stairs. Below, the sound of movement grew from a rhythmic thud to a chaotic, scraping frenzy. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his lungs burning as the air grew thick with the scent of ozone. Every floor he passed was being shredded by something sharp and relentless. He reached the landing, shoved the heavy door open, and lunged into the corridor leading to the roof. The hive was not just awake, it was hungry. The corridor ahead was a narrow throat of twisted alloy. Elias pushed forward, but the sound stopped him dead. It was no longer a distant thud. It was a rhythmic, frantic scraping that echoed from every direction at once. Thousands of claws were raking against the outer plating of the building, a metallic screeching that set his teeth on edge. He spun, rifle raised, as a section of the wall buckled inward. A jagged, obsidian limb punched through the steel, followed by another. The sound of clicking claws grew into a deafening roar, a cacophony of scraping metal that vibrated through the floorboards and into his very marrow. He fired a burst into the breach, but the bullets only sparked against the encroaching mass. There was no way back. He pressed his back against the vibrating wall, the metal groaning as it yielded to the pressure outside. Every inch of the structure was being dismantled. The clicking was everywhere now, a relentless, insectile chorus that drowned out his own ragged breathing. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. Elias slammed his shoulder into the final bulkhead, the rusted hinges screaming as they yielded. He stumbled out into the open air, the sudden drop in pressure making his ears pop. The roof was a jagged plateau of twisted metal and shattered conduits. He sprinted toward the far edge, but a massive support beam had collapsed, blocking the path. He scrambled over the jagged wreckage, his boots slipping on the slick, rain-drenched surface. The wind hit him like a physical blow, whipping against him and threatening to drag him into the void. Behind him, the roof access door buckled inward, the metal groaning under the weight of the swarm. He didn't look back. He reached the final, crumbling lip of the spire and skidded to a halt. The drop was sheer, a vertical plunge into the heart of the city. He dug his heels into the gravel, fighting for balance as the wind roared in his ears. Below, the abyss was no longer empty. It was a churning, living sea of movement. He stood on the precipice. There was nowhere left to run. Elias stared down, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The city was not a graveyard. It was a dormant engine, and he had just turned the key. Below, the obsidian towers were no longer static. They were shifting, grinding against each other as thousands of silhouettes poured from the ventilation shafts and subterranean tunnels. The green lightning pulsed, illuminating the plaza in rhythmic, strobe-like flashes. Each burst of light revealed more of them, a sea of jagged limbs and shifting liquid forms. He tapped his scanner, desperate for a count, but the screen flickered once and died, unable to process the sheer volume of heat signatures rising to meet him. The entire city hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. He watched as the swarm began to scale the spires, a tide of movement that defied gravity. There were no individuals here, only a singular, hungry purpose. He had come looking for secrets, but he had found a waking nightmare instead. The scale of the army was absolute. Every street, every bridge, and every hollow tower was occupied by the waking hive. He gripped the edge of the spire, the metal biting into his palms, as the realization set in. He had awakened an entire civilization from its long, cold sleep. The silence of the void vanished, replaced by a cacophony of rhythmic scraping. Elias pulled his hands from the ledge, his skin raw and stinging from the jagged metal. He turned, but the path back was gone. A shadow detached itself from the ventilation housing, its form shifting with fluid, predatory grace. It watched, head cocked. Then the city stirred. Every movement he made, every breath he drew, was being tracked by the hive mind. He was no longer the explorer charting a dead world. He was a foreign contaminant, and the planet was moving to purge him. He ducked behind a ventilation unit as a projectile of hardened alloy whistled through the air, embedding itself into the wall inches from his head. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. He checked his pulse rifle, but the power cell was drained, glowing a dull, useless amber. He threw the weapon aside. It clattered across the roof, drawing the attention of 3 more silhouettes emerging from the dark. He was trapped on a spire of glass and steel, surrounded by a world that wanted him dead. The hunt had shifted from a search for data to a desperate game of survival. Elias scanned the roof, his boots sliding on the slick, vibrating metal. The scraping sound grew louder, 1,000 claws clicking against the outer walls of the spire. He spotted a narrow maintenance hatch near the base of the central antenna, barely wide enough for a human frame. He lunged for it, fingers clawing at the rusted latch. It groaned, resisted, then swung open with a shriek of tortured steel. He scrambled inside, the darkness of the shaft swallowing him whole just as the first silhouette crested the roof edge. He pulled the hatch shut, the impact of a heavy, jagged limb vibrating through the metal door. He was in a confined space, the air stale and freezing. He checked his sidearm, the only weapon left. He gripped the handle until his knuckles turned white, his breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. Outside, the hive hammered against the hatch, a rhythmic, relentless assault that shook the entire structure. He did not look back. He faced the dark tunnel ahead, his eyes locked on the faint, flickering light at the end of the corridor. The hunt had not reached its conclusion. It had only just begun. He took a steadying breath, shifted his weight, and moved into the shadows. The screen flickered, the green lightning pulsed one last time, and everything went black.